Imagine yourself under a starry sky, around the warm glow of a sacred fire, where speakers gather to share their wisdom and insights. Creating a sacred space where all are welcome to warm their hands. Here are your hosts, Sarenth Odinson, Snow, Cabra, and Emily Streaking Fate. Discuss spirituality, mythology, animism, and culture around a virtual sacred fire. Won't you join us around Grandfather Fire?
Blessed Aku, great seers, great diviners, great augurs, those on the other side, those in the other realms, those who know, those who teach, those who bring, those who show, those who lead, those who guide and support, the spirits that appear in dreams, the spirits who reveal through card and dice, through lot and chart. May we have ears open to hear and eyes open to see. May our minds and hearts be open to receive and consider. May we get out of our own ways to accept the messages that you bring. Hail to the gods.
Welcome, welcome, welcome to another episode of Around Grandfather Fire. This is episode 138 with my good friends and co-hosts, Snow and Emily Streaking Fate. How are you both doing tonight?
I am good. I am going to answer first because Emily was drinking, but I am good. And I have some good coffee from the local cafe and have been writing stuff for my blog and looking at the books that I got, which I'm sure I can mention again later, as we've been doing a mini tour of pagan and new age shops in the Portland, Oregon area, which has been pretty fun. Yeah, I am good. How are you, Emily?
I am doing well. I have some toast and jam tea to wake me up and lots of water to keep me hydrated. I went through an initiation on Wednesday that I didn't realize was happening this early until Tuesday. So I am still recovering from that. But overall, I am doing pretty well. How about you, Sarenth?
I'm doing pretty well, all things considered. By hook or by crook, work has slowed down a little bit in terms of the overtime, which means that I'll be working, maybe one or two less days of OT this pay period. And I anticipate next pay period is going to kick right back on up. So, we'll see how long this lull lasts. I'm going to enjoy it while I can. The big projects that I've been working on, some of which I think we're going to talk about in this episode. I did the Odin Devotional at the start of September, finished that. That was a lot of fun. And I've been just really writing quite a lot this month, actually. I keep getting these notifications from WordPress. Hey, you're on a 12-day streak. I'm like, yay! So it doesn't take much. I've just been really bit by the writing bug lately. And I think part of it is because I put the book project down for so long, for the past couple of months, that I've been able to think
It's as if rest
on other
helps.
things.
Yeah.
That's weird, right?
Let's see, what else have we been encouraging you to do? Are you hydrating? Cool. Is that also
Actually,
helping?
yes. I have a lot of.
Cool.
What
What else are we nagging
is
Sarenth
helping.
into doing?
Oh,
Mm.
not being so hard on myself, and
Yeah.
that's a work in progress.
So
Um,
as much as a
it's
12-day
yeah.
streak is a severe public indecency act, how is writing so much going?
It's actually going pretty well. Some of these are posts that I've sat on for a while because I told myself I would just let them breathe for a bit, so I wasn't just reacting to something. So the most recent post I made called "How Meta" uh, has been percolating for months now, more or less finished, and I had like two or three paragraphs that I tossed into it and then said, "Okay, if I don't publish it, I'm never going to publish this damn thing." So some of these posts have been sitting in my drafts folder for literally 3 to 6 months. And I just looked around and went, well, I've got nothing else to do.
Yeah, I
Fuck
think
it.
every time I look, you have at least one new post up.
I'm very lucky in that my Patreon topic suggestion folks hit me up really early in August, like the end of August. I sent my reminder email out, hey, send me your topics, and they provided. So I had a minute to think
Hmm.
about the topics and write on them. I hope for my sake that Malik is done asking me about negotiation with spirits for a little bit and we can move on to something else because I don't know that I can plumb that particular
I mean, the
line
other thing is that you kind of
anymore.
don't you run the risk of, if you're writing your book on heathen spirit work, if it all ends up being on your blog, doesn't that kind of become a problem unto itself?
I mean, I kind of figure that the books
Hmm.
are going to be like a snapshot in time, and the blog is almost like a living document as opposed to, okay, this is as solid as I can get it and send it out into the world. And I would put somebody through their paces with this as opposed to my blog, which is you could probably piece together this book through all of my blog posts, like if you feel the inclination. But I'm going to have stuff that I've specifically formulated for the book in there, like exercises and techniques. I'm going to have that's going to be much better organized than what my blog is in terms of being able to find information and indexing. So there's that.
Yeah, and you wrapped up your Odin in 9 days devotional thing, right? So how was that?
Yeah. Oh, that was a lot of fun. So I got a little more personal than I was anticipating, but that's just how poetry goes sometimes. I mean, anybody who's written poetry, like you can't help but get a little messy with it sometimes, even when you're trying to keep to certain poetic forms. Um, so when I first read about this, and Kat was like, "So I do this 9 day devotional thing." Kat being Kat Heath, also known as Co Hellrune. Um, I said, "Well, you know what? I haven't done one of these in a while. Why not?" And it just really flowed really well. I found myself every morning kind of looking forward to the next day, and sometimes in the morning I'd write the post or I'd get something started and then I'd finish it afternoon or evening, just kind of depending on what kind of time I had. And every time I sat down, it was like some aspect of Othin or our relationship would come to the fore. So it was really impactful for me personally, but it was also some of these were kind of a challenge because some of them I kind of forced myself to use uh I guess you might call it imitation Galdralag, because like Galdralag poetic forms follow very strict guidelines and it works better with Old Norse because of how the language works. So what I was writing was probably more akin to what somebody transliterating would do, but that's, the best I got. But I found the restriction of some of the poems to be helpful because it made me formulate my thoughts in such a way that I was more, lacking a better term, naked.
You were on a 9 day streak whilst naked. Yeah, after the
Yeah,
12-day
that's what I was
streak.
gonna say.
If you want to donate to the Get Sarenth Clothing Fund, so Emily, how's you?
You could just donate straight to Grimfrost. To be fair.
Yes, I am a
Yes,
basic Grimfrost
the
bitch. I know.
self-proclaimed walking advert for Grimfrost.
I should get what's it called? Ad revenue or something. I know they have an affiliate program of some kind. I probably should sign up for it at this fucking point.
I was
So
gonna
you were
say,
asking Emily something.
What's been going on with you? How's your practice looking these days? Big initiations on Wednesday. And
Well, yes, Wednesday was a big initiation. Before that, last Saturday was actually Ann Arbor Pagan Pride Day. And Sarenth and I did the main ritual for that, and that went very,
Ann Arbor's
very
in
well.
Maine.
And
Ann Arbor's in Maine.
what?
But you did
Ann
the
Arbor
main ritual
in Michigan. Yes, we did. We like to shake up
tricking the
geography
non-Americans.
sometimes.
I'm sorry, go on.
You're good. So that day went, I think, better than I had anticipated. And I went to visit other friends for a Freyr focus ritual in the evening, which was also very good. Tuesday, my body started having some issues, so I had some divination checks and some like physical checks, and it turned out that it was preparing for initiation the next day, and the initiation that I was expecting to be maybe at the earliest in November was happening on Wednesday. And thankfully I had a couple of friends that were willing and able to drive probably a couple hours, because it was during rush hour, to come and help me out with that. Shout out to Malik and Black Cat. And the recuperation afterwards has been frustrating. So relaxing is hard. But I've been through this type of initiation before. And so I am just trying to be gentle with myself and lean on Sarenth, and lean on my spirits, and lean on my friends, and get adequate rest. This initiation is part of pack tradition, which I was already initiated to. There's just a lot of different types of initiations. I think everybody's initiation has been different. And I knew this was coming, and I had agreed to it beforehand. I don't think I realized all of the aspects, but that's kind of how initiation goes. I don't regret it, but it is having to remember to not overtax my body, which is very, very frustrating. I'm thankful that the woods are so close, because even if I go out for just a little bit, I can take my staff and go and have some quality time in the woods. Even if I'm not walking as long as I'd like to be, I can at least get that earth connection. But I feel like the spirits have been hopping a lot here, probably everywhere. It's getting up to be about that time. October is a big month for me, for my relationship with Hades. So I've been thinking a little bit about prep for that, but this past initiation has my mind a little distracted. So I will probably soon try to be refocusing on some Hades stuff, although Hades was involved with this initiation. Yeah, I've been trying to rebalance things. The lead up to the initiation, I was having some physical issues that are not uncommon for me when I go through this type of thing. So I am hoping that going forward, it will be a little bit easier for me to focus and set aside the energy that I need for certain activities. And being just more aware of what my body and my spirit needs. So I'm trying to reshuffle everything so that I can still work on what I want to work on, what needs to be worked on, but also not burning myself out. So that was kind of rambly.
You're good. I mean, you missed the last couple of episodes, so it's nice to see you again. And I'm sure our audience and us, I mean, Sarenth lives with you, so he knows, but me and the audience appreciate the update, and it's cool hearing about all the stuff you got going on as your fate is streaking, much like Sarenth has been doing.
So how about you, Snow? What have you been working on? What are the things that have been occupying your
Well,
life
I
lately?
am still in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, I think this is the last episode we were recording before I fly back to the Isles, because that will be next weekend. Yeah, we've done a bit of a tour of pagan and occult and new age shops in the area, which has been pretty cool. I got some new tarot decks, which has been really interesting. So I've been doing daily tarot draws, and to help kind of understand and contextualize them as I've been getting to know new decks, I've been doing draws from my Gothic runes alongside them, which has been kind of interesting. So the start of the week, I switched from doing draws with my Thoth deck, the Crowley Harris deck, to doing draws from my Marseille deck, which has been really interesting. And the difference between those two has been really interesting. So I'm kind of mulling that over and might end up writing something on that on my blog. Because both tarot deck systems, the Thoth and the Marseille, feel and are quite different to the Waite-Smith, which is kind of interesting.
So is the Marseille like a totally different like style from the Thoth and the
The Marseille
Rider-Waite-Smith?
predates them. Yeah, so I think
Okay.
if you kind of if you try and get a rough chronology of the evolution of tarot, you kind of get Solar Busca and then Marseille, and then the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn turns up, and then from the Golden Dawn you get both Waite-Smith and the Thoth deck. And then sort of Waite-Smith did what Waite-Smith did, and most of the stuff you see now is sort of variations on or derivatives of the Waite-Smith deck. But Marseille is older, and as I understand it, obviously I'm not, but as I understand it, in the French-speaking world, the Marseille deck is still like the big one, and also in the Spanish-speaking world, so in the Francophone world and the Hispanophone world, they're really big on the Tarot de Marseille. And so like famous experimental filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky, who made things like The Holy Mountain and El Topo, which people might have heard of, and almost made a film of Dune in the 60s. He has written books on the Marseille deck and has talked about how he's used that tarot deck to help inform his comics and his writing and his films and stuff. So if that doesn't speak
That's
to it being
cool.
big in the sort of French and Spanish speaking world, then I don't know what does, but it's kind of interesting. And I mean, a lot of the Marseille decks you see are intentionally trying to reproduce the older classical sort of late medieval art style of it. So I mean, that in itself makes it feel older, but then it doesn't have a lot of the associations the Golden Dawn introduced in Waite-Smith and Thoth. Like you get people extrapolating things and sort of adding them on later in their own systems and things, but so that's been kind of interesting. I also got I haven't got it to hand, or else I would read the full title, but I got a companion to Arabic philosophy, which is pretty interesting and cool. So I've been kind of slowly starting my way through that. Yeah. Ooh, indeed.
Ooh.
Because the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps podcast, I think I've mentioned before, which I am a big fan of. The main guy who does that, Peter Adamson, is basically an expert on Arabic philosophy, and so he's one of the editors of this book, and he's also the one who he's personally like edited and contributed a lot to the online philosophy encyclopedias and things on the pages to do with Arabic philosophers and stuff. And it's really interesting because you really do see how Hellenistic and Greek philosophy went straight into Arabic and Persian philosophy. Whereas in Western Europe, we didn't get that till much later as people were bringing things back through the Crusades. And so that was what started the Renaissance. Whereas the Arabic world's already sort of sat there stroking their beards and debating Plato and Aristotle and stuff. So that's been interesting. Right.
Over cups of coffee, no less, which is
That's how
the
I do all of
superior way to
mine.
do your philosophy.
And I also got a signed copy of Morpheus Ravenna's book on the Magic of the Otherworld, I believe is the title. I can double check that and get it right in the episode description. But the day that I landed, they had done a book signing locally. And so we went there a couple of days later and they still got some kind of signed copies left on the bookshelf. So I got me one of them.
That's
so I've
awesome.
kind of skimmed through the introduction. I've yet to properly sort of get into the main chunk of the book, but that should be good because we had Morpheus on a while back and they were a good guest and they are interesting people who know a lot, and it's cool seeing them write about sort of magic in sort of Celtic mythology and such. So yeah, that's been really cool. Otherwise, yeah, just kind of chipping away at the usual stuff and doing rituals and getting back into sort of something of a daily practice here, which has been nice. Wrote a blog post, let me think. Published a blog post yesterday at the time of recording on navigating dating a fellow pagan polytheist occultist, which is interesting and a first for the both of us. So that's been interesting. And I think that's all of the major kind of news and headlines and things. Yeah.
That's awesome. I something I was thinking about as you were talking was I'm sure that your work with geomancy and the Picatrix is going to be helpfully informed by the investigations you're doing into Arabic philosophy, since that's the groundswell for where that particular divination system really kind of comes out of.
Yeah, I know we were talking sort of privately off air a week or so ago about it being interesting how much does come from the Arabic world and the Islamic sphere and Persian culture and such. I mean, right down to things that we take for granted, like algebra and the number zero, which didn't exist before that. So yeah, because we were kind of mulling over how everyone is very aware of ideas that we see in modern pagandom that come from Christianity or come from Jewish culture, Kabbalah and things like that. But we don't necessarily think about geomancy and how big that got in the Arabic world and how much astrologers and astrological magicians pull from the Picatrix. And spirit workers use the jinn as kind of a reference point and such, and that all comes from there as well. And that's kind of interesting. And also seeing how that all gets navigated in the Islamic world, whilst Islam is still very much a monotheistic religion, like fiercely monotheistic. And so how they're kind of framing and viewing all these different beings and spirits and planetary spirits and angels and such within that lens is kind of really interesting to look at. And so seeing the kind of through line from Platonism there is kind of interesting because they kind of get Platonism more directly than sort of Western Christianity did. Right.
Yeah, almost like a straight info dump into what would become the core of
Right. It's kind of
modern
interesting there
Islam.
because you sort of see in the ancient world that kind of monistic polytheism where it's kind of many gods and such, but then that kind of one original source or one capital G god that kind of connects and the others emanate from or derive from or are part of or what have you. And then how a very monotheistic religion that just has one god is kind of navigating that and reframing a lot of ancient Greek pagan works and such. So it's kind of interesting. And you see, I mean, you hear a lot about how in geomancy, each of the figures has its own spirit and such, in the same way that we might talk about that with runes or with tarot cards or things like that. But that's also one of those cases of, if it does exist and there is a list somewhere, it's not been translated into English out of the Arabic. So that's kind of anyone's guess unless you are an expert on and someone who can read and parse Arabic or Persian. Because, you know, in the Western world, we have a lot of focus on things from Latin and Greek, to the point of kind of ignoring things coming from Arabic or Persian or even Sanskrit further east, or sort of Chinese and things like that. So especially in the kind of occult sphere and sort of astrological magicians and stuff, there's a big kind of push to say, don't suddenly take up Latin or Greek to get into this stuff. There's enough people translating from Latin and Greek. Learn Arabic or Persian. That would really help us out with filling some gaps here.
And that makes total sense, especially because you've got a lot of completely untranslated sources. Something that I was watching, Dr. Angela Puka and Dr. Justin Sledge just did a companion piece to each other's video on the Cliffot, which is the negative, the husks, the negative spheres of creation, if you will. This is a very, very, very basic idea, guys. Like, go watch the go watch the damn YouTube videos. But the point that I'm aiming at is the Lurian texts that he's using as a backdrop for a lot of this shit have not been translated into English. They are still very much in the Hebrew they were written in. And you have to not only know Hebrew, you have to be able to parse what the rabbi is talking about. And, you know, you've got countless authors from mystics, imams, and astrologers, etc., who have put out amazing amounts of work, but us in the West, like, we're some of us are still getting just second, third hand translations of what the Renaissance had.
I mean,
at
that's
hand,
been
which
one of the
wasn't very
interesting
much.
things with the kind of resurgence of Hellenistic astrology in recent decades, is a lot of that is the discovery and unearthing of some of the ancient materials in the ancient Hellenistic world and around Egypt and Alexandria and so on, and then the ability to be able to translate from the original Greek rather than getting it sort of, as you say, second, third, fourth hand from, here is an English translation of the Latin of the Greek, or an English translation of the Italian from the Arabic, which came from the Greek, or, you know, things like that. And so, yeah, being able to do that could really be sort of interesting. I mean, even with my sort of current ongoing sort of tarot studies, getting the Tarot de Marseille out has been kind of pushing my French and my Italian there, because I found that a lot of the things out there on understanding tarot are very much oriented around Waite Smith in English. And so if I type into, you know, my chosen search engine, Tarot de Marseille meanings or whatever, a lot of it's just in French, which makes sense because it's, you know, the Marseille Tarot. So trying to project the Waite Smith meanings, which not only came later, but are also from kind of a different era, a different culture, and then a different language, kind of feels sort of ham-fisted. And I mean, that's just cards in one tarot system and cards in another tarot system. So trying to apply that to something as big as theology or philosophy, where you're dealing with Latin on one hand and Arabic on the other, it's, you know, almost sort of worlds apart.
I love that you're looking into the Tarot de Marseille. One of my favorite Marseille decks that I have, and I can't think of the name at present, but the guidebook is completely in French. And I think I have some resources in English, but they are very, like, a lot harder to find. But yeah, I think Tarot de Marseille is a deck that a lot of English speakers are not as aware of, and they're maybe a little more scared of. But I've found it to be, I've been more challenged by the Thoth deck. I've tried to spend time with it, and I have resources on it. But I jive better with both the Rider-Waite and the Tarot de Marseille. So I'm excited to see how your studies
cool and
develop.
sort of convenient thing about the Thoth deck is that as they were designing it, they were also writing the book and the meanings and everything else out. Because I mean, it's the Thoth deck because it goes with the Book of Thoth that Crowley wrote, and so it's all kind of right there for you. And that was all sort of within the last century and a half, something like that. So I mean, that's all right there for us. Whereas once you get into Tarot de Marseille, and especially if you try and go further back and go into Lenormand or Solabusca or something like that, it's kind of, well, we have these fragments from medieval France here, these from medieval Spain here, these from this Italian kingdom here. And then we're trying to piece them together enough to have a working functional system. And then we've got to translate them. And, you know, I mean, the Marseille deck that I got is really nice, but the booklet it comes with, each card just gets like 6 words. And I'm like, at this point, there's no point in me even looking at the booklet. I just have the cards and just go online if I'm really struggling here, and then, you know, do it that way. I mean, an interesting thing I was saying about sort of comparing the Waite-Smith deck and the Thoth deck, if you kind of want to view them as almost sort of contemporaries to each other, is that I find the Thoth deck, a lot of the depth is very much in your face. Because whereas the Waite-Smith deck, you pull a card and go, oh, it's, you know, the 7 of Cups, say. You then kind of have to sit and meditate on it and do your reading and do your research to find out what other associations and things Waite and Smith were kind of thinking of and wanting to connect it to and such. Whereas if you pull the same card from the Thoth deck, Crowley and Harris have it all right there. So the Kabbalic Hebrew letters are right there on the card in the artwork, as are any mythological elements, as are any astrological symbols and stuff. So it's really all there in your face. And kind of how much of it you want to pay attention to and really dive into is kind of then up to reader discretion. But it's very much obvious where all the kind of intricacies are. So it's kind of interesting there.
I'm wondering if my Shadowrun Tarot isn't more based on the Thoth deck because of how goddamn in your face that deck is. It might just be because it's based on Shadowrun and I jive with that RPG system really, really well. But it's got that in your face visceral feeling that I don't get from a lot of tarot decks. Like I'll get some, they're like, ooh, this is really pretty, or ooh, this is really evocative. Shadowrun, like for me, just straight up walks up and decks you in the face and says, "Let's go, chummer."
Yeah, I know my Waite-Smith deck, which is back in England, is very much my deck because I mean I'd put off buying my own tarot deck for years and years and years because I was like, no, I'm going to wait until I find one and really resonate with it, and we're really going to click, and then I'm going to get that deck. And it finally happened, and I backed this Kickstarter and got this deck. It's the Wandering Spirit Tarot, off the top of my head, if listeners want to go and look up the artwork or whatever for that. And it's by a Korean artist who designed it whilst she was kind of navigating her depression. And so the artwork is a lot of kind of this feminine figure with a skeleton. But I mean, something about that deck, just it and I really get on, and I've found it very kind of very easy to read, very easy to understand, and just kind of naturally fits with me. And the times I've done readings for it with it for other people, or I've shown other people when I've sort of drawn cards for myself with it, they're like, oh, that is you as a deck. This is ridiculous. So it kind of being that intuitive has been really interesting. I was just thinking on the matter of kind of things being sort of on the surface, or you kind of have to do your research and thinking about things to try and find the deeper connections. I'd imagine, Sarenth, you've really found that in the case of runes.
Yeah. Oh my gods. Especially because, like, especially when I was a baby heathen, like back 18 years ago, you had Futhark by Thorson, you had Leaves of Yggdrasil or Northern Mysteries and Magic by Freya Aswin, and you had Not a lot else because Thorson controlled most of the publishing that went through Llewellyn. So it was his book getting sold the most in terms of to the public. And it, up until, um, gosh, I think the mid 2000s, we really didn't have a whole lot of new rune books that actually challenged people where they were at. So part of the issue with that was just getting something in my hands, let alone something that was worth fucking reading. The other thing too was that the scholarship when I started was still in its infancy stages compared to what it is now. The rigor that modern rune workers apply, I cannot tell you how night and day it is. The fact that we have whole groups of rune workers telling people read the damn rune poems was not common advice when I started. And I really fucking wish it had been because it would have saved me so much fucking trouble. That's not to say when putting aside the horrible Islamophobia and shit for just a hot second, because at the time when I picked up the book, I didn't know about it, and she hadn't shown that much of her ass. Freya Asmund's book hit me at a really good time because it kind of bridged the gap between ceremonial magic and heathen rune work. And I believe, if my memory is serving me correctly, I since lent out the book and then the person took off with it or something.
You gave away the rune book, and it is now gone to the Gununga Gap where the runes emerged from.
Pretty much, yeah. That also happened with Taking Up the Runes, which again, another author who has completely shown their ass, who I thought produced an excellent volume. Fortunately, she also references Thorson, which is something I kept asking her, hey, next edition, can you make sure they take that shit out? You don't need it. Didn't happen. And it could be because of the author, it could be because it's Llewellyn. Who knows? But you're right. A lot of the struggle I've had over the years has been really alleviated by having access to better and new information about what runes look like, how they were used. Because for a while there, I was getting this insistence, this dogged insistence from archaeologists and folks who specialized in runology. Well, the only thing that runes were done with is for writing. And I'm like, no. We have entire sections where rune magic is very clearly talked about and used. And finds like the Cragahul spear, finds like half the new stuff we're finding where it's like it's a word that might be like alu or some other method of bringing forth a rune blessing or curse where it's multiple runes in a row now is being interpreted by archaeology as, okay, this is probably a spell, or this is probably some sort of spirit work, magic, etc. Like I think we're very much in a golden age of information where the archaeology and information is concerned.
I do think it's kind of interesting seeing how that narrative is kind of ongoing and how that conversation has been happening in and around heathendom, in that, yes, runic is a script or a series of scripts that sort of inform different languages across the kind of Germanic world and so on. And you do see the argument and the point given that, well, these are just letters and anything else you want to sort of apply to them is then onto you. But then you kind of get into the conversation of, well, is all writing inherently magical? Is all writing inherently kind of a gift and so on? Because I mean, in so many mythologies and so many different cultures and things, you do see a scribal god, a god of writing, who is also often also the god of magic, of mysticism, of wisdom, of learning, and all of these things are very much bundled in together. And so kind of Odin's association with wisdom also being, Odin was the one who brought out the runes. It's kind of interesting to kind of mull over and think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important and indicative that we look at not only writing but speech itself, because there's so much ink that's been spilled, and it depends on what culture you're looking at. Whether you're looking at, first Genesis, or you're looking at the first breath that Odin gives humans in the Norse creation story. The imparting of wisdom through words, whether it's written, oral, there's magic there. And I can't speak to the Irish traditions, but my many conversations with PSVL and looking at the writings of Morpheus Ravenna and others indicates to me that like speech and poetry and satire and all of these things contain a primal, beautiful element of magic and power with the Megan. And we really deny ourselves access to this entire breadth of understanding when we're like, we are going to like just close ourselves off to a deeper understanding because archaeology has not verified this for us. Like, I am okay being wrong from an archaeological perspective because I'm not a fucking archaeologist. Like, I am okay having an interpretation that does not always line up with where academia is, if it means that I'm getting the spirit of the message versus the absolute literal translation. I mean, at some point, I have to account that maybe in 30 or 50 years, everything I am doing is right now found to be founded on somebody pulling something out of their wild hair out of their ass, and everything I've built my life around, academically speaking, has no footing. Okay, so I've joined like all of a cultum.
And that also brings you up to the question of, does it work? And if it works, how much, if at all, should you change if academia comes forth with new theories or new finds or new discoveries? Because if every time you have a new find or a new discovery, you completely reinvent your entire practice and religion and such, then how much was it working to begin with, and how committed to that were you really, versus how much are you just trying to chase academia and find some kind of academic approval for what you're doing?
Yeah, a very frequent criticism that I levy at heathens in particular, because they're my people, is, do you want to be amateur archaeologists, amateur historians, amateur anthropologists, amateur literature majors who just happen to be worshiping the subject that they're studying, or do you want to actually be heathen? Because there's a big fucking difference. And my work may never pass academic rigor, and I'm fine with that. That's not who I'm writing for. That's not why I'm writing it. I have a two citation, either in an APA or MLA format for that kind of thing. But I'm not writing for academia. I'm writing for our living religious communities, right? So at the end of the day, who am I writing for and why am I writing it for? Like I said, like, okay, so tomorrow, let's say like there's this bombshell archaeology discovery that puts a lie to everything that I've built my entire identity around as a heathen. Maybe somebody made up all the rune names and it's, this, that, and the other. Maybe all of the the rune poems that we have are complete bullshit fabrications. Okay. I'm connecting to something that I can identify as rune spirits, even if the runes as such, as I understand them, are academically incorrect. I am still connecting and making deeply positive change in my own life and that of others through these connections, regardless of whatever the niceties of the intellectual institutions have to say about it. Okay. Like, I have to be okay with that at some point. Because otherwise you're having an existential crisis every time a new archaeological find comes out.
I mean, that also brings you to the kind of merit and value of revelations and people's personal gnosis, personal experiences with the divine and such. I mean, my Gothic rune system isn't historically attested. It's me looking at the Futhark, the Norse runes, and looking at Greek isopsophy and the alphabet oracle in the Hellenistic tradition, kind of theorizing, hypothesizing that if you took a people who were Germanic originally and then moved them into the Hellenistic world and they came up with their own system, this is what it might look like. And then they could use this as divination, and it has numerological values as well as graphological values, as well as all these different meanings and stuff. And then kind of sitting on it and writing my own kind of verse for each of the characters and such. Which is kind of why I end up kind of sitting there and sort of scratching my head a bit when I see heathens getting into the minutia of, well, the elder Futhark has this many runes and the younger Futhark has this many runes, and if I'm this kind of heathen, I should be looking at this particular Futhark that has this many runes and exclusively looking at these rune poems. And it's like, well, does that vibe with you? Does that make sense? Does that feel like a fit, or is this kind of, are you forcing this because it feels like part of the package you signed on for?
Is your aesthetic of heathenry overriding your sense
Right.
of what your heathenry needs to be? I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure that you've encountered something similar too, Emily. Sorry, please go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I really like how you phrased that, Snow, because it's really interesting to me how, as pagans and polytheists today, a lot of times we are looking for the right package practice, whereas like polytheist and pagan ancestors, it was kind of the hodgepodge that worked for them. What gets me results, what helps me feel good, what makes the crops grow. These actions, these rituals, these spirits. Oh, I visited this place. They have a really cool spirit. It seems really strong. We're going to bring him home and put him on our altar too. And I am not saying that having like the prepackaged is bad, but I do think that sometimes people try to force it more, and discredit the idea of making it something that is really authentic for what works for them.
Yeah, I know you sort of see in sort of Kemetic circles a lot of arguments about divination and what is correct, and also you really see arguments when people start looking into ancient Egyptian religion about where exactly they want to draw their box. And so they'll go, well, we stop looking once you get to the Ptolemies, or we'll stop looking once the Romans turn up, or well, we'll go right up to you get the beginning of Christianities, or well, okay, we'll go right up to early Islam. And it's kind of wherever you draw that cutoff point, you're leaving stuff out as well as including things. And so then you get people sort of going back and forth and bickering and saying, well, can we use this astrological technique here? Because really that comes from the Babylonians. Is it really quote unquote true Egyptian? Or, well, this comes from the Greeks. So this is the Ptolemaic era here, clearly. So is that quote unquote true Egyptian? Or, well, if we're looking at casting lots, how much of this is actually Egyptian source material versus Greek or Roman later stuff? Or you sort of get later on into sort of towards the Gnostic Hermetic kind of period and say, well, this is contemporaneous with early Christianities, or, you know, Muslims took this and translated it into Arabic, and we've had it back out of Arabic or out of Persian, and how much can we actually rely on this kind of thing? And it's kind of, you get a lot of bickering there as well as sort of where you're drawing the boxes and lines and such.
Oh, especially with the question of, well, what is true blah? What is true Heka? What is true rune magic? What is true polytheism, right? Like, and it's not like I haven't been involved in some of these debates, vociferous and very blunt about how I see things. But I think that's also part of the strength of the pagan and polytheist communities is that we could have incredibly divisive debates and still at the end of the day we're all kind of in our communities and still at least in some circles able to be in circle with each other, be in ritual with each other,
In
be
some
together
circles, we can
in
be in
some faction or
circles.
another.
Eloquently put.
Another
Yeah.
Got to put that shit in a t-shirt.
If we needed an episode title, in some circles, we can be in circles. So then, okay, open question for the pair of you. If someone wanted to get into divination, because that is such a big thing in pagandom and occultdom, what would you say was maybe the easiest form of divination to get into straight off the bat?
Personally, I think it very much depends on the person. For me, my first form of divination that I got into were tarot cards. I loved all the different artwork. I thought they were beautiful. I did not jive with the original Rider-Waite deck. It took me a long time to come around to it. But there were a lot of other decks that I absolutely loved that were in the wider Rider-Waite tradition. But I initially tried to memorize the keywords or memorize the meanings of the cards, and that didn't work for me. It wasn't until I looked at the minor cards as energy of the numbers, like the words are hard, numerical energy, and then the energies of the suits, and putting those two things together. So instead of memorizing the definitions, having that equation of what is the energy of this number, what is the energy of the suit, what if there's a picture on the card, what am I getting from that picture? And so for me, because I love numbers, like that worked really, really well for me. Runes came way later, and I used runes in a magical sense way before I started doing divination for them. It took me a long time to come around to being able to use runes for div. So for me, cards, tarot cards first, and then oracle cards. Well, maybe it was oracle cards and then tarot cards. But I do think it's very dependent on the person, because I know for some people, pendulum right off the bat. I'm always worried about the shakiness, and there have been times due to medications that it was not a viable thing. But I have gotten some accuracy from pendulums. But yeah, cards are my go-to. But again, I think person. Sarenth?
I think for me, my first div system ever was the Rider-Waite Smith deck, and I clicked really, really well with it. But you know, former Catholic, so a lot of the imagery was close enough to something I could parse that it wasn't completely alien to me, and it provided me enough of a landing pad for my imagination that even if I didn't know the like, this is the meaning of the card, more often than not, I was getting intuitive answers that I hit close enough. Let me think. My first, when I asked if I could read professionally for the first time at a store, she had me come in for a uh, class so that she could see if I actually knew my stuff, and asked me a couple of questions during it, and asked if I'd ever picked up the deck before. Like, no. Like a week later, she's like, "Okay, look, let's try you at a trial run." and that's how I began reading professionally. Was I just kind of walked into a shop one day and said, "Hey, it says here you need a reader. I haven't read this before, but fuck it, let's try it." um, for me, tarot was really easy to get from that perspective, and I kind of got more associations as I read books in that occult shop that were around me. I think it's one of the nice things about the Rider Waite system is that you can start from a very bare bones metaphoric level for a lot of these and still get a lot of good shit out of them. It's one of the nice things about using a very visually coded divination system, because you start looking at runes and you're like, what the fuck is that? What could that be? Um, so a lot more digging in and study with when the runes came into my life. But I also found myself working with them in divination more than I ever did magic starting out with. So it's almost the complete reverse of you and I, Emily.
Yeah, I think if a beginner was coming to me with the sort of question for recommendations, I think I would either suggest either the Waite-Smith Tarot deck or I would say Geomancy. And the reason being that you can look up the meanings and the meanings are right there. And you can get just a yes or no kind of answer fairly straightforward from either of those divinatory techniques methods. Whereas I think something like runes can often seem a bit sort of oblique for people because people draw a rune and say, well, what does this mean? And then I'm met with people going, well, go read the rune poems. And then they go read the rune poems and go, well, I don't know if this helps. And it's because people kind of need to sit with them and kind of chew on them a bit. And other things, I mean, I used to do pendulum like maybe in my preteens, but I mean, I can't do pendulum now because of my tremor. So it's just swinging around the place and like, this isn't reading anything for anyone. And things like astrology can be really good, but that requires study before you can kind of get to the point of being able to ask and answer questions. And I think other tarot systems maybe to me feel like they need a bit more study and are less easily accessible or approachable than Waite-Smith is. And especially if it's an older or more obscure tarot tradition, especially in the sort of modern Western Anglosphere, where you do kind of have to go out of your way to look up meanings and interpretations. Because I think if you're a beginner, you want something you can do easily. So pulling a card from a deck, anyone can do that. And then you want to be able to go look up what that means. And yeah, Waite-Smith, it's right there because Arthur Edward Waite wrote it out while Pamela Coleman Smith was drawing them. And so that's kind of straightforward enough. And I mean, geomancy, we had Polyphonies on recently, and he was saying when it comes to geomancy, you can get a pen and paper and do some dots, make some shapes, and then you go look up what the kind of the judge of the chart means, and there's your answer right there. And so then that's kind of straightforward, and you can kind of do that anywhere. You don't even need to carry a deck with you or carry dice with you or whatever. So then I guess, oh, go on, Emily.
No, I was just going to say you make a very good point about how easily accessible, like when you're starting, the resources are for like the Rider-Waite-Smith. So I probably would suggest a Rider-Waite-Smith based deck, though not necessarily the Smith-Waite, unless someone did vibe with it. Just because I know for me, I was so against it. And I do think there's a lot of really good Rider-Waite-Smith decks that have similar meanings that go along with it, that maybe have artwork that vibes more with people. But yeah, it is an interesting thing to think about, because I do think of the runes as individual spirits, whereas I think each deck can have a spirit. And I do think the artwork and what the artist and the creator puts into it can have an input on how the deck reads and the results. But for just learning purposes, having a deck that has a good guidebook or is easy to look up stuff, whether online or in the book, makes a lot of sense. But then, if somebody is much more nature-based, people will create their own divination systems with stones or in nature. Though for me, that was something that came later, I think. Having a basic system where I could look up and see a divination system that was already created, like the tarot. And then later on, I was able to make like my own oracle deck that worked for me and my spirits, or learning about divining in nature and looking for the answers that way.
I think so. I'm kind of a couple minds about this. So one of the things that I immediately thought of was like one of your many, many oracle decks with very simple phrases on them. I would probably, if somebody needs like a straight divination system, I'd probably hand them a deck like that, where it has the meaning on the card, and maybe it's a pretty picture of a geomantic symbol, or maybe it's a picture of a goddess or something, but it's got the meaning right on the damn card. I would probably hand some, like if you're a stark newbie and you just want a deck to ask questions of, I would probably go that route, or I'd go with Rider Waite, just because that's what I started with. RWS was what I started with. But to your point with the divining with things in nature, like the 3-stone divination that I got taught a long time ago, where you got an indicator stone, a yes stone, and a no stone. You can just pick these up off the ground and toss them and see where they land. Excellent way, no cost at all. You're not shucking out 20 to 40 bucks for a deck. So, from that perspective, and like you mentioned with geomancy, you don't need anything but a pen and paper. And I mean, like any more with some of these, like if you're not especially caring if it's a physical deck or not, you can shuck out nothing and get a deck on your phone. Like there are tons of tarot apps out there. So I guess our modern folks are really spoiled for choice. That's almost the inverse of what it was like when I started, which can be really funny and frustrating on the opposite end, because it's like you can't just tell people, oh, just go Google this, or go find an app. Like, okay, what of the 50 would you like me to go look at? Do you want me to search with DuckDuckGo, or should I do a Google search, an actual Google search? Because I'm getting a lot of AI bullshit. Like,
I was thinking while you were talking earlier, actually, it's interesting because I see a lot of former Catholics and a lot of former Muslims who become to pagandom or occultdom talk about bibliomancy, because there is sort of almost something of a tradition there with Christians flicking through the Bible and coming to random pages and seeing where their eyes land first, or Muslims doing the same with the Quran. They sort of skim through, stop at a certain page, stop at the surah they're on, and read something, and that kind of answers their question. And that's something that I don't see loads of pagans or occultists really talk about or go into, which is kind of interesting, because that almost could seem very sort of straightforward, particularly if you are someone who's already okay with sort of analogy and metaphor and allegory, and don't need everything to be really sort of blunt and spelled out, because you can do that with, I mean, you could almost argue you could do that with any book. I mean, I have a very good friend who does that with her copy of Lord of the Rings. She'll ask a question, sit on it for a bit, grab her copy of Lord of the Rings, skim through, stop at a page, and whatever sentence her eyes land on is her answer. And you could, I mean, again, you talk about accessible and low cost entry. That's kind of right there.
Oh yeah. Gosh, that's really neat. And then you get into stuff like divination using like Spotify or whatever your favorite music app is, and you throw the fucker on shuffle, hit forward, and see where the song lands.
Yeah, for her birthday, I got my partner the Grunge Tarot deck, and all of the major arcana cards and all of the court cards all have a song referenced in the booklet. right? And so to the point where at the back of the
Ooh.
booklet, there's even a discography that just lists everything in the order that it appears in through the tarot deck. And so I made her a playlist of all of them. And a witchy friend of ours said
That's
that because I've
badass.
created this playlist for her, we could almost kind of do it in reverse. And so she could hit shuffle on the playlist, hit play, and whatever it goes to, you go find that card and read the meaning, and then that's the answer to the question. Right. As opposed to
That
kind of
makes a
the way
lot
it's
of
designed,
sense.
where you kind of pull the card and then it references a particular song, and then you listen to the song for context of the card artwork and meaning and such.
Funny enough, you can do that with
Right.
Warbruna's first 3
Because
albums.
that's, yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Just
mm,
load up the first 3 albums and then hit shuffle and see
yeah.
which rune pops up.
So then something you kind of mentioned earlier then kind of brings us to the question of, when it comes to the kind of tools and devices and things that we are talking about here when it comes to divination, do you use them differently when you're trying to use them in a magical context as opposed to a divinatory context? Because you mentioned with runes using them for reading and answering questions versus runic magic, and you see a lot of people doing sort of magic involving tarot, and sort of, I mentioned astrology for answering and asking questions, and you get astrological magic. So how do you approach them differently there, or do you think it's more of just a continuation of what you're doing?
I'm trying to punt to Emily, but she's not taking the bait. All right, so ask me one more time. I'm sorry.
So, if do you see a distinction between how you use the runes for doing a reading versus runic magic, or do you view it as just continuing and not stopping at just the answer?
So the way that I first off will think about it is it's a working with, it's not a using. And for me, that kind of unfolds the rest of the process, whether it's divination or whether it's magic. It's all spirit work to me. So I think that marks my perspective a bit different than other heathens who might approach the runes solely as magic. Um, so when I'm approaching them to do magic, it's consistently referring back to them. Hey, how do you feel about this combination in this bind rune if I'm making a bind rune? Um, oh, for instance, I've got a couple of bind runes right here, actually. So I've got Ansu's and Gabo together in a sun wheel. And every time I turn this thing, the magic moves forward. So the Ansu's, the cleansing is grounded, is centered as I turn this. The communication that I'm bringing forward is a centered communication, both in myself and in the spirits. So when I constructed this bind rune, I sat down with Ansu's and Gabo and said, how do you feel about this artistic interpretation of you two together? Does this gel right? Does the sun wheel format for this make sense? What do you folks think? And then I take that feedback and then I either do or don't design the bind rune based on the feedback I get. An even more simpler one is just 4 urus together in a sun wheel. And I work with that to bring power and might every time I turn the sun wheel. And these are Woodbird. These are on just simple $1 discs you can get from pretty much any craft shop. Um, and depending on how deep I want to go with a given piece of work, I might do divination to figure out which runes I want to be involved and in what way. And the divination is usually just pulling runes and seeing who wants to join the party and then going from there. It's funny because like I've done this for so long that it's sometimes a bit having to take a step back and explain my process. It's like, oh yeah, this is how I do things because so much of this process has come full circle to being really intuitive for me that explaining the steps is sometimes a little it's not that I don't have steps, it's that I've done them so much that this is just an organic process
It
for
does.
some of this.
So
Does that
back
make
in
sense?
your earlier days, when you were just a little Sarenthling, um, did you go into sort of using the tarot in magic, or was that purely a divinatory thing? Okay.
No, I never used the tarot for magic. Um, I knew there were folks out there who did, and they got really good results with it, but it never clicked for me. I tried.
When you were trying, so we can keep talking while Emily thinks. So when you were trying with that, did it feel like a very different approach, or did it just feel like doing a divinatory reading with the tarot and then keep going?
It felt fucking alien because that was not what I was working with this deck for. Um, keeping in mind at the time, I was also like getting into ceremonial magic, so there was precedent in the material that I was reading. It just would not click for whatever fucking reason. Like there are people who are like, well, I work with the high priest to really like boost the energy of the ritual and really make sure that I'm paying attention to this, that, and the other. And I shove energy into it through the, using the strength card. And I'm like, that sounds great. None of this shit works for me at all because I would sit in ritual with it and I would try to make the thing go the way that the various instructions I had in front of me were telling me to do the thing. Visualize the lion bringing power, or visualize the high priest designing this ritual. You're really like boilerplate guided meditation things, or use the energy of the really vague descriptions of use the energy of this card to bring blah energy to your ritual. Cool. So I tried this, and I would sit in the circle because at the time I was doing magical circles quite a bit. Um, and I would try to make the thing go. And if you've ever like tried poking an engine that refuses to turn on, that's kind of what it felt like. It was like you're not using this for the purpose that we're talking. Sorry, dude. I don't know if it was just me not vibing with the ritual format, because I mean, this was like 19 years ago, somewhere in there. I'm not sure if it was the ritual or how it was written or what, but it just did not work for me at all. And God's help me, I tried.
So what about you, Emily, when it comes to all this stuff? Do you kind of approach it differently if you're using it for magical workings versus a reading?
I do, and I think that is part of the reason that it took me so long to be able to start doing divination with runes. Because it, as Sarenth said with the tarot, it seems so alien to him. It seems so alien to me. And as far as my tarot and oracle decks go, I have used them in magic before, but it is not something that I do often. And perhaps it is that there's a connector piece that I need to work on with both like the div systems and with like the rune spirits. Because like for as far as the runes are concerned, they're the same spirits. It's just whether I'm asking them to assist in this magical work or whether I'm asking them for a forecast on a certain situation. But to me, those two things feel very, very different. And so whether it's doing either with the runes or doing either with a deck, it's always felt very, very different for me. And so it's almost like reacquainting myself with the same energy in a new way. I suppose it's like if I had a coworker and then all of a sudden they started dating my cousin. And so I had to get to know them as maybe my cousin's girlfriend, as opposed to as my coworker. It's the same person, but it's different roles. And so I would approach them differently in that space. And yeah, like it took me a really long time to come around to even trying very hard to do div with the runes, because I tried initially when I first got runes and it did not click. And then I started using them magically, and that felt very easy, very right. And it just took a long time for me to come back and start getting to know them for divination.
How about you, Snow?
Yeah, I think for me it is very much a continuation. Um, I don't know. It's kind of interesting. I've never been one of those people as a rule. I'm sure there've been exceptions to this that I can't think of off the top of my head. I've never really been one of those people who'll put a rune or a tarot card on my shrine. Because I mean, if I do a reading, I'll put it there as kind of a reminder to think about it through the day. But otherwise, I don't go, well, I'm going to give ritual to XYZ. So I'm going to get the tarot cards associated with them and put them out here or anything like that. I have done magical workings where I have drawn sort of Gothic letters or found the numerical values of Gothic letters, and kind of done things that way, sort of creating my own tablets and improvising things that way and sort of creating sigils and such. And I suppose in that way, it is a kind of continuation as to how I would understand them if I asked a question and got an answer. And the handful of times I've tried to do things with geomantic figures, I generally produce a chart to get the figures that I ought to use. So it's almost like I'm asking the geomantic figures what I ought to be using for a given working and then going from there. Or I'll kind of sit in meditation and sort of see what feels appropriate and kind of go that way. So I think for me, it's kind of the overlap of a Venn diagram. The way I use them for a reading and the way I use them for magic aren't entirely separate, but aren't necessarily entirely the same. Does that make sense? That feels fairly rambly. Cool.
I get it.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I will say that one way that I can think of where it overlaps or has overlapped for me specifically is if I do a reading and I want to try to change the energy of the results. And that is either putting things from Merkstave or reverse upright to try to put energy into quote unquote a better result or something that I'm looking for, or laying cards over or that kind of thing to kind of shift the pattern a little bit. But otherwise, like in every other situation, those two things have been very, very separate for me.
You just reminded me of what would be a really good question to ask now, especially for any listeners who are very sort of new to this and are kind of first wanting to get into divination. Do you read or consider reversals, inversions, merkstaves, etc.? Or do you go, this just fell the wrong way round, let me turn it?
That is an excellent question. Yeah, I think that there's no one way to answer that question, right? Because I've always read reversals, and I know that as far as rune reading goes, that's basically an import from reversals in tarot decks. But for me, Merkstave and Bjartstave makes sense. Darkstave and Brightstave for those who don't read Old Norse. So for me, it makes sense, but it might not make a damn like I know a lot of diviners who don't read reversals on anything. So I think it's very much a your mileage may vary, but figuring that out sooner rather than later is really important.
I would say, as far as I'm concerned, it depends on the deck and the timing as far as cards. Certain decks I will always include reversals. Certain decks I will never include reversals. Certain decks, it just depends on how I'm feeling at the time. As far as runes are concerned, I do include mark save or reversals, but I also sometimes include whether it's tilted one way or the other. And with round decks, that can be a factor as well. Like there's some circular decks and they can come up, a quarter turn one way or a quarter turn another way. And sometimes, again, depending on if I feel it's a factor or not, I will have that influence my reading.
I think
What about you,
by and
Snow?
large, I don't. If I have a tarot deck where it was very much designed with inversions or reversals as a consideration, then I will do. But I think I probably read more into the intention of the tarot deck's creator than I think a lot of other people do. With runes, it depends. With my Gothic system, I don't, as a rule, unless I feel it's significant to do so in some way, which is very much a kind of spur of the moment, kind of intuitive thing. If I'm using my Norse Futhark runes, sometimes I do. I mean, again, I suppose it depends. If it feels intuitive in the moment, appropriate to do so, then I will. Geomancy, I won't, because if you reverse a geomantic figure, you have a different geomantic figure. That's just how that works. If you draw it upside down, you have an entirely different figure already of the set. So then you've kind of changed the meanings, but then you can kind of sit and contemplate the relationship between those figures. So then sometimes the reversal of one signifies a lack of something or something like that. So as a rule, I don't, but I know there have been times where it feels appropriate to do so, or something is kind of intuitively or instinctually kind of saying, no, this time this fell this way for a reason. So then I guess if you're reading Merc staves with runes, are you doing that based on intuition or what the spirit of the rune is saying? Or are you going back to the rune poem and sort of going, well, this now means the opposite? Or are you getting one of the many rune books out there that has a Merc stave meaning and rolling off that? Go.
That is an excellent question. I think for me, the Bjart stave and Merc stave thing made sense because, yeah, there are non-reversible runes because some of these are just they're up and down or they're going to be in opposition. So the way that I read would be like if it's on its side, it might be one of the nastier. If it's a non-reversible rune, if it's on its side, that means maybe not the reverse, but like the blocked understanding of what that rune poem was about. Or so this kind of an intuitive process. It's kind of based on the meanings that are in the rune poems. It's also what's on the mat already, or in my case, what's on the rabbit skin. It really depends on what's in front of me. But generally speaking, if it's a rune like Thurisaz, if I get Thurisaz in reverse, I'm usually going with the more nastier portion of Thurisaz. So usually I break it down to, is it Thorn or is it Thirst? And if it's in reverse, I usually go with a Thirst interpretation, which isn't always a bad thing. Like I've had times where somebody's like, well, how should I approach this situation? And if it's Thorn, I approach that as a self-protection, be cautious, mind your P's and Q's. Thurisaz is really good for this because I get different meanings based on what the position of the thorn portion is. In reverse, I usually like, if it's thirst, I get bring your primal self to bat on this, kick ass, or be prepared to deal with if we're talking about a spirit, be prepared to deal with a nasty spirit that means you ill, or be prepared to deal with somebody who may not be operating at their best because thyrses are really aggressive and really nasty in a lot of cases. With the point is facing downward, I usually approach that as a doom of Damocles kind of a thing, especially if somebody's coming to me with a situation where they're approaching this with a lot of trepidation. Oh, congrats, you have anxiety about this. Yeah, and there's reason for that. However, maybe there's other runes that can provide a way forward, but the Doom of Damocles thing comes up when that point is facing downwards, like it's a guillotine. When the point's facing up, I usually understand that as caltrop. Like, mind your footing, mind your P's and Q's. Where are you putting your feet? Have you done your due diligence? Did you document? That kind of a thing. And some of this is extrapolation from the rune poem, and some of this is just I've read with these for so long. This is what I usually get when these things pop up. And sometimes it's the rune will take a hold of me and go, okay, look, I know this is normally what you get from this, but this is what you need to tell them. Like, you're getting this portion and you need to tell them this portion. So like if I'm getting thirst, sometimes I get the really nasty thirst that comes forward and it's going to wreck shit. Sometimes Thurisaz takes me aside and says, okay, that idea, but apply that to self-empowerment. Sometimes you got to be the prick. I hope that answered the question.
I would say when I first started trying to use runes for divination, and when I went back to trying to use them for divination, I Googled Merkstave meanings like every time. So I'm sure those are still like rattling in my head. But at this point, I tend to try to listen to what the rune is telling me, and intuition plays a part, and my like previous experience plays a part. And for me, like the visual aspect plays a part. Like Hagalaz, the hail rune, when I draw that sideways, it's like a sled going over the field of hail, fallen hail. So it might be a bumpy ride, but I have support to make it over that. And I think just because of the time that I've spent with the runes at this point, I am a lot less likely to Google meanings. To be fair, I do live with Sarenth, so I can just be like,
Google.
"Hey, 20, hey, yeah, hey." He's like the 25th rune. You are the blank one, Sarenth.
Yeah, sometimes.
Although now,
sometimes when I'm staring at a div, I'm like, yeah, I am the fucking.
No, go ahead.
Because I have no idea what the fuck is going on. Please go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, now that you have hair, I can't just like rub the top of your head. But yeah, I think because of the time that I've spent with the runes and getting to know them in a magical sense, that it's easier for the meaning and the reading to like pop out for me. And I also, because of my interactions with Sarenth, the idea that upright can be outer facing and Merkstave inward facing. And I think that's like a visual aspect for me as well. Is this rune having an effect on the outward level, or is this rune having an effect on the inward level? Or is this effect happening from the outside, or is this effect happening from the inside? And as far as tarot cards are concerned, and oracle cards, although some oracle systems, if it has reversed meanings, I tend to keep with that specific oracle system guiding. But for tarot cards, I feel like an upright tarot card has all of the meanings of that card, whether it's upright or reversed. Some decks do the artwork shifts when you turn it. And so those I will tend to read more often with reversals. But because I tend to prefer to read with spreads, so there's each tarot card is in a specific position answering a specific question, then whether it's a more quote unquote positive or a more quote unquote negative meaning might depend on the question as much as the card. And I do think there's so many layers within a specific card that sometimes if you always read with reversals, you can limit some of the nuances. That might be an incorrect way of stating it, because everybody reads the way that works for them. But if you look at a card or direction as being specifically good or specifically bad, I think you take some of the nuance and the gray out of what could be a helpful answer.
No,
That's a really good point. Oh, go ahead, Snow. I was just going to pick it up with like Hagalaz is often looked as like the shittiest rune to get, no matter what is going on. And I have had Hagalaz come through on some readings where shit needed to dynamically change, and it wasn't like, "Congrats, this is the hailstorm that is going to wreck your life." It's this is the hailstorm that you need in your life in order for the rest of your life to actually be able to breathe. So I think that getting out of black and white mindsets with your divination tools before you start forming those associations is a lot easier than trying to take them off later on. That's the only thing I wanted to mention.
So kind of with an awareness of time, and we could be here for days talking about divination and different systems and techniques and tools and such. And if people have questions or want us to go into this on another co-host episode or whatever, feel free to let us know on the Patreon, or if you're on the Discord server, if you want to suggest it or put forth any questions, or if you want to ask any of us individually, please do so, because it'd be really cool to get into that. So before we kind of wrap up divination, what is one piece of advice you would give to someone new to divination? I suppose to give you both thinking time, mine would be feel free to go slow and don't feel you have to memorize everything, because there's nothing wrong with having to look stuff up. That would be mine.
Mine would be to record your readings, whether you're writing them down, whether you're doing a voice recording or a video recording of yourself, or taking a snapshot of the cards and like saving that picture. And if you can, try to record some of the results that you get. Like if you see how you see that reading playing out like a day or two later, or whatever you read for 3 weeks later, or as a job, how it affected, looking to see if the results that you saw in the reading is what happened and where those met and where things were different. So you can kind of look back and like, oh, I see this item that I didn't see in the cards then, but looking back, I see it in the cards now, so that you can take that knowledge for future readings. Sarenth.
Gods, this one's hard because like 3 things immediately popped up. I would take at least a solid year of doing study with a divination system before you make major life changes with one. I think you can get really excited and really into a divination system, and then it can kind of eat your life if you let it. So the second piece of advice I would have would be, do not divine any more when you're learning a system than once. And that once, I mean in terms of, either once a day, once a week, once a month, whatever you can handle. If you start to see that this divination system is starting to dictate how you live your life, put it away for a while. I say this out of experience because I did that shit with the runes and they ran my life on every little thing, including what I ordered for dinner. Okay. It was bad. uh, Third, make sure that you are not glomming onto a divination system purely for the aesthetic. It needs to communicate with you. It needs to be something where you get it eventually, even if you have to study for a year before you get it. If you are reading runes because you're a heathen and that's what you feel like you're expected to do, put that shit aside. If you really want to read runes, but it is not something you should take on because you feel like it's expected of you. Likewise, if you're a witch, you don't have to read tarot. If you're this, that, or the other thing, you don't have to do this, that, or the other reading system. Whatever reading system you end up working with, it needs to be something that communicates to you, or there's no point.
I'm also going to jump in with the remember that doing div, even when you're learning, is using your energy. If you're sick, if you're really busy at work, if you're really stressed, like putting the divination away for a while so you can use those energetic resources for what you really, really need. And just remembering that if you're studying, it's okay to take breaks. You don't have to do things every day or every week or whatever. But if you notice you're getting really tired or really drained, putting the div away for a while can help you recoup some of that.
So we have a question from the community. It could potentially be a very big question with very long answers. And I'm sure this is a topic that we're going to touch on in future episodes. We've definitely touched on it in past episodes. But on our Discord server, Drac Fletch wanted us to talk about being in and maintaining religious community, and within that, balancing ritual and socialization. So as everyone takes a gulp of water, I think myself on that kind of sub point there on balancing ritual and socialization, I think for me, that is something that I think, if I'm being completely blunt, I find irritating quite often with pagan and occult communities, in that if you're going to a physical meeting, a virtual Zoom meeting, join a Discord server, join a subreddit, and it is oriented around, let's look at ancient Greek oracles, let's discuss Thelema, let's discuss heathenry, let's study the Eddas, etc., and you have the purpose of the place or the purpose of the meeting is for that religious element. If all it is a bunch of people who turn up to hang out and discuss what work's doing and what the weather's doing and they just want to drink, I find that kind of frustrating. And for the people who are organizing it or moderating it or doing the administrative work, it kind of feels slightly insulting to them if that's what it mostly turns into, or that's what most people are there for. I think the social element of religious community can be very important, but for me, that's a byproduct rather than being the main thing people are rocking up for. So that's kind of my soapbox rant about that. So yeah, being in and maintaining religious community.
All right. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Sarenth.
So I guess that the question is like, what's the ritual for? What's the socialization for? I can understand having some social time before and after a ritual. But if I'm there to do ritual, I'm there to fucking do ritual, and I'm not there to delay the ritual for a half hour so you can finish whatever fluffy bullshit conversation is padding out the time. I find the pagan community's insistence on pagan standard time to be fucking irritating. And part of this is like, take it from my mindset where I just worked 151 hours out of the last 2 weeks, and I spent all that time at work. I did not come here to bullshit. I came here to do a ritual, to do the things that we need to do, to close the space down, to honor the gods, whatever else, and get the fuck on. Now, there are times and places where socialization, as part of a ritual, like if you're doing a feast day, that's totally understandable. But if an ostensibly serious ritual or serious insert happening here is being taken up with fluff and bullshit, I'm not likely to stick around for very long, because if you're not going to take this shit seriously, why should I? Especially when I have really limited time and energy to devote to this. So I have very little patience for that kind of shit anymore. What I do have patience for is the needed socialization that goes on around, what are your taboos? What do you need in terms of support? How are you doing? How's the family? Like stuff where we establish rapport as people, as part of a community, I'm cool with, up to the point where it starts interfering with the purpose of us being there. This is, it doesn't make any sense to run the clock arbitrarily because you want to have a conversation that doesn't pertain to what we're doing.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I have left like online, monthly meetings of certain groups. If like the first 15 minutes of the group was people ranting about completely unrelated stuff, and I was like, I don't have the energy for this. I don't have the time for this. This is not why I came here. And I enjoy group rituals in person, partly because I like the social aspect. But I also prioritize and hope that the other people there are prioritizing the ritual. And the ritual, for me, coming together for the ritual first is the most important thing. And then if we can develop connections outside of that space, checking in with each other about our families, or having a little time before it's supposed to start, or a little time after it ends to do that. I appreciate that, because I do appreciate those connections. Finding other pagans and polytheists or other people in your specific traditions that can help you if you have questions or if you need support is awesome. But the older I get, the less patience I have for waiting around or hanging around in spaces where, like you said, Snow, people just want to talk about the weather or their job or other things in a space that's supposed to be specifically for a religious or spiritual or cult topic. Not that I don't want to support people in those areas, but if I'm coming to this space, this is what I've saved my energy for. And then it will get spent on the non-parts, the non-issues, the non-related, I should say, the non-related things. And then it's kind of like energy that I saved for the spiritual, religious, occult thing, and it got blown on this other stuff because that's what that space was filled with.
I think the other thing that really bothers me when there's not like defined boundaries, defined terms, defined etc. with regards to balancing ritual and socialization is if you don't know where the in and out spaces are, when are the gods being honored? How are they being honored? In what capacity? And this is also true of ancestors and Vaethir. If I can't tell that, can they? And if I can't tell that, can they? is this going to be a ritual that I want to lend my soul parts to? And I'm not saying like every ritual that I walk into is like a dire wagering of my souls, but I think the gods and my souls deserve at least some consideration for showing the fuck up. If for nothing else, then it's a hospitality thing. Like just bare bones, and like as a heathen, like that's a huge obligation, both on the part of the person hosting the ritual and in part of everybody participating in it. If we are going to have a space where this is supposed to be sacred, it needs to be devoted to the sacred. That being said, sacred doesn't mean you have to have a stick up your ass at all times. But if we're waiting 15 minutes into ritual, I'm going to take the stick out of my ass and beat you with
I
it.
think part of it is if it's well designed, if everyone is there for the right reasons, everyone is very much aware of why they're there, then there may well be breaks. There may well be, let's all go for a drink after, let's all sit down and eat after, something like that. So then there's a very obvious, and this is kind of off-topic time if you want to kind of take online rhetoric into that. Like if you went to a university lecture, then any lecturer who knows what they're doing and has planned appropriately will go, right, everyone sat and heard me talk about the topic for in-depth for X amount of time. We'll have a 20-minute break, and then you can all talk about the weather and the game last night and whatever else, and then we'll get back to it. And then afterwards, everyone goes out for lunch and does whatever. And I think similarly, you see in sort of online spaces, you have the on-topic areas, the off-topic areas. I know increasingly I seem to be seeing online spaces where they're getting rid of off-topic areas because they feel like they're taking over too much, which, I mean, I can definitely understand and have definitely seen that in lots of spaces online. And so then it's kind of interesting because then they're sort of saying, well, if you want to talk about the game last night or, you know, the cute photos of your pets or memes or whatever, just take it to DMs, go do it elsewhere. That's not what this space is for. And so then in kind of a different way, you're sort of working around that, which is kind of interesting. So sort of conscious of the length of this episode so far and the time, I think regards to maintaining religious community, and I mean, again, we'll definitely get into this in later episodes. I think the last thing that I want to say for now on that is just be aware of why you're there as an individual, be aware of why everyone is there collectively, but also balance that with not being so insular that you're tunnel visioned, and be aware to kind of broaden your horizons and interests and things. So what kind of final thoughts do you two have?
I would say I think it's super helpful when there's designated, like you said, a designated break in a lecture, designated social time that people are aware of. So if they want to be present for that, because I do think it's helpful for people when they get, especially if it's a certain time, a live event, whether that's in person or online, for people to come to the space and maybe they need to shake things off for like 5 minutes or 20 minutes or however long, or in the middle, take a break and just ground and whatnot. And I think being aware of being respectful of other people's time and also being compassionate because certain people might be going through difficult things. And so just being considerate of the time, but also trying to be as compassionate and empathetic as you are able. What about you, Sarenth?
I kind of come at it from two different perspectives. So, like on the one hand, a lot of the rituals we do in our home are very dedicated time, space, hearth rituals. They're very short, and all we do is a very quick 5-minute prayer at the end of the night. Like that's one of our big rituals is our night prayers. We also do meal prayers. All we ask of the people that are involved is that you're present, you're mindful. If you're going to do the prayer, or otherwise be quiet. If you have your own prayers that you want to do before or after, we allot space for that. When it comes to the night prayers, if folks want to participate, awesome. We do 3 deep cleansing breaths address our gods, ancestors, and Vatir, thank them for the day we've had, and then move on. It's really cut, dry, simple. Partly it's because there's only so much attention that our youngest can give at that point. But also, a lot of us at that point are either waning or on the way out to our next thing that needs to happen. So we're not going to spend a lot of time in depth in ritual, rocking and shaking and doing all the say their stuff. We're there to just pray, thank the gods for the day we've had, and move on. The other thing that so there's that part of it. Like that's part of maintaining a religious community in terms of hearth cultists. Like you have expectations that everybody conforms to, or they sit out the ritual, and the ritual is like a 5-minute prayer, and maybe an offering of water. The other thing is when you're in things like conventions, like Ann Arbor Pagan Pride or Convocation, this sometimes will crop up where, especially with Convocation, because they tend to do a lot more heavy rituals in terms of content. Like they also run for an hour and a half, whereas Ann Arbor Pagan Pride runs for an hour. You got to be really mindful of your own personal energy reserves and not put that on the ritual participants beside you or the ritual staff if you're attending somebody else's ritual. And also, you know, if you're hosting a ritual, you have to make sure that you're not blowing all your energy in a death and rebirth ritual before you have to host a party for Dionysus or something. So, you know, there's give and take there, and part of that is just being mindful of your obligations and responsibilities, both with your particular part of the community and with the wider community, and also just what's your portion? What is yours to do? And so that's where a lot of, I think, balancing ritual and socialization, both in terms of personal and more large form communal stuff, really shakes out for me.
Cool. So yeah, I'm sure we'll get back to community on future episodes, and we've definitely talked about it on past episodes and stuff. So thank you, Drek Fletch, for that. So Emily, if people are wanting to balance their doing what they do already with finding out what you do, where can they go to do this?
They can go to my occasionally updated blog at streakingfate.wordpress.com.
If you
How
are
about you,
wanting to
Snow?
balance what you do with finding out what I do, you can go to snowthegoth.com or linktree/snowthegoth. I am also fairly active on our Discord server. I am fairly active on most of the things that we happen to be on. What about you, Sarenth?
Well, if you want to find my work and if you wish to balance your life in that direction, you can find me at sarenth.wordpress.com, patreon.com/SarenthOdinson. You can also find me on Three Pagans on Tap with Malik Odinson. And I believe our next episode for that is going to be October the 1st. So please join us. We are going to be at 9 p.m. EST, and we're going to be online on YouTube. So thank you.
And you can find podcast stuff at patreon.com/aroundgrandfatherfire or aroundgrandfatherfire.com. Feel free to check out our Discord server. It is very active. We're all there. We all have our own spaces. We are cool people. You can come talk to us and ask us to talk more about divination if you want, or ask us to talk about other things on other episodes. And you'll also get updates on upcoming guests and things if you do happen to join our Patreon. And from the Kindling tier up, you can join these live. You do not have to be a Patreon patron to join the Discord server. The Discord server is public, but any and all support, whether financial or otherwise, is very much appreciated.
All right, and I think that is going to be all for this episode. And I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our Patreon supporters. Thank you to our folks in Discord. And thank you to all you folks out on the internet listening to this podcast. Thank you all. We will see you next time around the fire.